I tried to stay with the microphone today. Thank you very much for listening to my reputation. It always feels a little strange, and you start to wonder, is that really me? And yes, it is. And of course, it's a dilemma when you do that kind of double careers. You have to negotiate time, always. And for me, coming to do the Shaffer lectures was an opportunity to really dig myself into scholarship again and partly retrieve memories of what I had been doing and partly trying to be bold enough to move into new terrain. Today I'll stay home in the sense that I will talk about chapter 24 in Luke. Tomorrow I'll try to do a little more of a comparison between John and Luke, and also try to explore the development of second endings and what the second endings do and do not do, and why they tend to multiply when they're first there. But today, the Lucan version, yesterday was John, where Jesus was in transit from I don't remember. What was yesterday's title? He was in transit. I remember he was in transit 2 texts, because that was the original part of it. That the text was the outcome in John. Pardon? Tangibility, of course. Thank you. Your memory is better than mine. So it's from tangibility to text. And today is a twist on the same transition, but it's called from earthly to heavenly existence, but it also has to do with tangibility and not tangibility. The closure of Jesus' earthly mission is not his resurrection. His earthly existence is prolonged beyond death and grave when he again is with his disciples, re-establishing community. However, his presence among his disciples in a physical, recognizable form comes to an end after which they no longer see him. And these words are very carefully chosen. In Luke, this radical change is narratively cast in spatial cosmological terms as a bodily transfer from earth to heaven, even though heaven is a little open for a while. Differently from in John, this event, at least in the second version, belongs as much to narrative as to discourse, and that's a reference to yesterday. Luke 24 maintains unity of place and time. During a very long day, it all happens in or near Jerusalem. The first to go to the tomb in the early morning before sunrise are the women who had followed him from Galilee. And they become exclusive witnesses to the consecutive events of his crucifixion, his burial, and eventually his absence from the tomb. Finding no body, the women receive from the dazzling angelic men at the grave, according to the best text, not an announcement of the resurrection. Rather, they are told not to look for the living among the dead, and they are encouraged to remember what Jesus told them already when in Galilee, which they do. So the theme of remembrance is a very central theme in Luke, and it comes up constantly in this chapter too. However, the women receive no commission, as in Mark and Matthew, even if they do come forward as the first witnesses without any mention of hesitation and confusion. They take it upon themselves to do it. The list of the women's names come pointedly at the close of their story, just as required in a formal protocol of testimony. They are, however, met with disbelief by the men, with some exception for Peter, who goes to see for himself, establishing that Jesus is not there, as the women had already told, and wondering about what might have happened, as if their message had not been received. Such inconsistencies are clearly due to a combination of different traditions, but may also be taken to prefigure the report given by the two disciples on their way to Emmaus, which in its turn leads to the Christophanies, which follow where there is no uncertainty or closed eyes. It is, however, difficult to discern any convincing promotion of a Petrine primacy in coming to faith. Faith is first evoked when the risen Christ shows himself. In this perspective, the women's visit to the tomb, as well as Peter's, are aborted in the sense that they lead nowhere further. This be as it may in terms of tradition history. In the narrative it creates suspense, and this suspense is prolonged into the first appearance to the two disciples on the way from Jerusalem to Emmaus. The two had been in the group of those who, according to verse 9, had been together when the women returned from their visit in the empty tomb. One of the two is named as Cleopas. The other remains anonymous and could therefore be anyone, which I prefer to the suggestion that she might have been Cleopas's wife, even though that is a possibility. The story is of remarkable length and without parallel in any other gospel. A true legend, according to Rudolf Bultmann, and slightly less pejoratively, a circumstantial narrative or tale, as C.H. Dodd says. To Dodd this meant that it was marvelously well told and full of Lucan usages and motives, but not to go by for credibility, solid for solid information. It clearly comes from a tradition particular to Luke and has been embellished by the evangelist to catch and comment on Lucan phraseology and themes, among them the motive of being on the way. The story is conceived of as a journey, both literally and hermeneutically, and the latter is as important as the first. The two are leaving Jerusalem to return to where they came from, like Peter, who returned home after his futile visit to the empty tomb. This is his time of going home. They are disillusioned and sad with heavy hearts and minds struggling to come to terms with what they take to be the tragic closure to great expectations. They express the hurt of misplaced hope, of faith no longer knowing what to believe. They are at a deadlock, with no resolution in sight. It also implies that the story of the empty tomb and the appearance stories not only are from critically different categories, but also pose different questions, which, although interconnected, should be kept apart. The empty tomb is, as we have already seen at the beginning of the chapter, a disappearance, a missing body mystery, which in the Gospels of Luke and John leads to a kind of body hunt, further enhanced by a strategy of suspended recognition as well as of doubt and disbelief. When the missing corpse appears well and alive, He is not to be recognized for whom he is. There is also a form-critical distinction between the two kinds of stories, disappearance stories and ascension stories, but I'll not go into that today. Attempts at explaining this secrecy or miscomprehension are multiple and vary from assumptions about the disciples being blinded by grief to them being spiritually blind to the transformed nature of the resurrected body of Christ. Interpreters are sometimes incredibly inventive. Jesus' reproach to the two on the way to Emmaus as they meet this traveler they don't know who is. Their eyes are blinded, so they don't recognize him for whom he is. And this creates this secrecy and misapprehension which needs to be explained. And the inventiveness, as I said, of certain interpreters means that the disciples are being blinded by grief because they are spiritually blind to the transformed nature of the resurrected body of Christ. Jesus' reproach, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets has declared, is therefore taken to refer to their closed eyes. Other interpreters identify as the irony of this story the counterpoint between the totality of facts recounted by the two disciples and their incomprehension with regard to the meaning of these events, sometimes spelled out in the Christological terms as the scandalon, that the messianic access to glory is through humiliation. Much good theology, but not much good exegesis in this. If not necessarily wrong, interpretations such as these misidentify the problem. The blindness of the two that keeps them from recognizing Jesus does clearly not affect their ability to react and respond adequately to the questions asked by their unknown companion as he joins them on the road. Nor is there any indication that they do not listen and learn when he, in the end, interprets the scriptures for them. In a way, I suppose that you know the history or the story, so I don't recount that. Indeed, they later say that their hearts were burning when he spoke. He also seems to be the same as he once was, since their failure in recognizing him is because their eyes are deliberately being kept from knowing him. Their eyes has been closed from knowing him. That's stated twice, and it also says precisely when their eyes are opened. In literary terms, this is an excellent example of how recognition or anagnoresis in Greek dramaturgy, in various ways and by various means, should be delayed, not for the sake of suspension itself, but in order to coincide with the completion of the author's argumentation. Accordingly, in Luke 24, Jesus vanishes from their sight at the very moment when their eyes finally are being opened to see him for whom he is. While the identity of the traveler who joins the two on the road remains hidden to them, it is revealed to the readers at the very beginning. So we are in the know. Thereby, another line of suspense is created as the readers are kept waiting for the moment when the two disciples will learn what the readers already know. This discrepancy between the two disciples in the story and the readers as the narrator's confidants I think Saint John of Damascus was one of the first to reflect on this particular point. And this is, however, more than a clever device of narrative suspense, and certainly more than the wisdom of hindsight. It maintains within the textual tradition itself a permanent struggle for meaning, as it admits that multiple interpretations are possible and even reasonable, while at the same time maintaining that certain events are at the core of the hermeneutical task. There are in the Emmaus story two subtly connected hide-and-seek strategies. The identity of their fellow traveler is hidden from the two disciples in the story, whereas the readers have no excuse for not recognizing him from the beginning, since they have been made the author's confidants, as already mentioned. What is kept from the readers, however, from us, is an account of that which Jesus disclosed to the two disciples when he opened the scriptures to them. The story thus harbors a subtle connection between the unrecognized appearance of Jesus and the hidden meaning of texts. Not surprisingly, yet again, eager interpreters have tried to help the author out by providing the implied list of proof texts. You find them in most commentaries. There is, however, no way of deciding whether such proposals are correct or not, and the significance of what the text withholds should be appreciated and respected. I mean, there's something about respecting the silences in the text itself. It is indeed remarkable how vague and general the reference to Moses and all the prophets are. As the repeated all the prophets and all scripture emphatically conveys, the point is not the particulars, but rather the conviction that the whole of scriptures bears witness to him. In the Lucan story, the Emmaus in the Lucan Gospel, the larger story, the Emmaus story calls off the search for the body of Jesus. His disciples have seen him and been with him in a manner that proves that it is not for them to find him. He shows himself in his own due time. They are not finders of his presence, they are receivers. This is the Emmaus story, further reinforced by a pattern of role reversal. The questioner is in fact the teacher, and the guest acts as host when in the final scene the presence of the Lord is revealed in the act of breaking the bread, stated in almost Eucharistic language. This is the moment of anagnorisis that carries with it peripateia, the surprising turn of event, which has been called a wonderful way of describing meaningful failure. However, that story does not end with this moment of recognition. Jesus does not remain with them, but disappears as abruptly as he had arrived. And that is, of course, liminality in this context. Also, the two disciples leave Emmaus within the same hour and return to Jerusalem to re-establish community with those they had left behind the very same day. In Luke 24, collection and reiteration are combined in a mimetic pattern which actualizes the emphasis on remembrance in Luke and also traditioning. And Luke demonstrates here one of his most remarkable narrative skills, the parataxis, that of gathering a number of disparate episodes into one single coherent narrative. the congregation of the many disparate stories within one coherent narrative represent also a reception of multiple witnesses into the one witness of a restored and reconciled community. According to the language of the Emmaus story, subtly but repeatedly it indicates that the two on their way to Emmaus and the persons to whom they refer as they talk are part of the same larger group which they have left behind in order to return to their own place. The road to Emmaus proves to be a roundabout to Jerusalem. On their return to Jerusalem the very same night, the two are reunited with a group of disciples from which they walked away. Immediately and rather abruptly, they, and we, as readers, learn that the risen Christ also has appeared in Jerusalem to Simon. No appearance story is attached. They, as we, are simply informed that it has taken place. Occurring where it does, it has, not surprisingly, been taken to overshadow, even completely displace and preempt the announcement of the other two, in order for Simon Peter to be first. However, this is not, as far as I can see, communicated in any striking manner by the paradoxical story itself. Rather, the two from Emmaus respond by reiterating their story yet again. The Jerusalem story of the Lord's appearance to Simon Peter and the story of Cleopas and his companion disciples on their way to Emmaus. That's a comment. Are merged with the story of the women into a shared recognition of Jesus' restored but different, indeed liminal presence among them. Differently from on earlier occasions, such as the last meal in chapter 22, and this is important, no argument about prominence arises. Rather, they are mutually giving account as they are reunited. There is no discussion about being first or most important on this occasion at all. As the story further unfolds, Jesus, according to Luke 24, 36 to 42, appears to the whole group, not only the 11, but also their companions or affiliates, perhaps such as Cleopas. Two sin of toys is in the text, the Greek. Again, this happens suddenly, while the disciples talk together, digesting the stories they have heard about more exclusive showings. And again they are surprised. And this surprise seems to be a permanent feature of the appearance stories. As they talk among themselves then, Jesus suddenly stands among them and says to them, "Peace be with you." They are startled and terrified because they assume that they are seeing a ghost, a pneuma, and this of course refers also to the discussion yesterday about ghosts. But he says to them, "Why are you frightened, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And when he said this, he showed them his hand and his feet. While in their joy they were still disbelieving and still wondering, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish. He took it and ate it in their presence. Then he said to them, "These are the words I spoke to you while I was still with you." And then it continues. In this episode, blindfolding is not a feature. But the disciples are terrified, since they take him for a pneuma. The manuscript D clarifies the term pneuma by introducing the term phantasma, which is more like a ghost. The term pneuma was used about those who had passed away, as in 1 Peter 3, where it most likely refers to those who are kept incarcerated in Hades. In Luke 24, the disciples possibly fear that he is a restless spirit on walkabout from Hades. And the story may in fact also serve to counter such interpretations of the appearances. Jesus himself explains that he is not a spirit, and the emphatic enlisting of solid physical evidence is notable. He is the same corporeal Jesus they once knew, and it's a very strong feature in this story that has also led to the theological point of view that it was a bodily resurrection, fully and truly, which I think varies in the Gospels, but here it's clear. Not only is he visibly recognizable, being flesh and bone, he may be touched, which is the commentary on yesterday's talk. The Thomas episode in John 20, which we dealt with yesterday, have led many to suggest that also in Luke 24, 39-41, when Jesus shows them his feet and hands, it is in order to display the stigmata, so that his bodily presence may be recognized by the marks of crucifixion. However, whereas this is an explicit motive in John, it has been implied in Luke. Here the hands and feet apparently serve primarily as the bodily parts most easily available to be touched and examined also when it comes to probe and prove that the substance of this resurrected body of Jesus is solid flesh and bone. Furthermore, having his bodily functions intact, he also eats. This is a unique feature in this Lucan episode, even when there is a meal involved, such as in the Emmaus episode and also in the later story, as we will see tomorrow in John 21. The resurrected Jesus acts as host, but does not himself partake of the food. In Luke 24, 41-43, in this story I'm now talking about, this pattern is remarkably reversed. The disciples feed Jesus, and he eats in their presence to demonstrate that he is neither a ghost nor is he an angel, because angels didn't eat. Also, other accounts in Luke 24 have an emphasis on corporeal incorruptibility. When the women at early dawn on the first day of the week go to the tomb, they bring ointments and spices to anoint the body, since this had not been done when he was laid in the tomb. Their preparations are to no avail, since his body is not there. The living is not among the dead. God has freed him from the pangs of death and not left him to experience corruption, as Paul later says in Acts. Jesus' body is resurrected. It was not left to perish, but has returned to the land of the living. Accordingly, the narratives that follow about how the risen Jesus appears to his disciples in earthly circumstances emphasize the incorrupt physicality of his resurrected body. Being in liminal transit, he is betwixt and between, elusive and not to be found, arriving apparently from nowhere and vanishing suddenly. At the same time, there are no markers invoking that he is not to be recognized, or that his appearances should be perceived as epiphanies, manifestations from heaven of the already exalted law, as some have suggested, like Zwiep, who quotes with sympathy Klaus Berger's phrase, Auferstehung in der Himmel hinein, and shares the understanding that the appearances of the resurrected Jesus in Luke 24 therefore are from above. He goes up and down for the appearances, but only during a period of 40 days when an exclusive apostolic instructions take place to give time for that. Adela Collins assumes that in the Gospel of Mark, the story of the empty tomb implies that Jesus has been transformed, has left the world of human beings, and has been transferred definitively from earth to heaven. This may well be so in Mark. I'm not going to discuss that. But I think an interesting point is that Mark does in consequence not narrate the resurrection appearances. There are no appearances in Mark. That most probably both, he doesn't recount the resurrection stories that most probably both he and his audience knew. Because that explains, in a way, this abruptness, I think, in the end of Mark. But we will have to discuss that later, Adela. Whenever Jesus surprisingly and abruptly appears in the Lucan's appearance stories, he is to be recognized as the Jesus they knew, still present among them on earth until his final irrevocable departure. The departure story, to choose a cautious term, I'm now being cautious and not speaking of ascension, represents material peculiar to Luke, and it is told twice in remarkably different versions, first at the end of the Gospel, and then again at the beginning of Acts. Nevertheless, there is no reason to believe that the two versions are not meant to refer to the same once-only event. And as my next lecture will show tomorrow, I take the version in Acts not only as a new beginning of a second volume, but also as a second, more developed and later ending to the Gospel of Luke. Is replacing the ending or being more expansive on the ending already there. The reason I mentioned it, and I mentioned already here, is that the story in Acts has become what might be called a master story of the ascension and departure of Jesus. And one can see with that how it governs our eyes and our mind when reading departure stories of Jesus. It frames our understanding of his departure. The ascension story in the Gospel may not be as fully developed, but it is marked by terms of closure. The disciples are, and now two important words, collectively and differentiatedly. Collectively and differentiatedly, with no singled out but none particularly mentioned by name, commissioned to be witnesses from Jerusalem onwards, as soon as they have been empowered from on high to proclaim repentance and forgiveness of sins. The commission is sealed with a blessing of them all. The perspective is that of the disciples. Jesus withdraws out of their sight in what seems to be a final act. He no longer shows himself visible and tangible in their midst. In fact, he never again appears on earth in bodily form. There is no reassurance of everlasting ubiquity as in Matthew. No promise that Jesus himself would be with them always and everywhere, as it happens also in Matthew. Indeed, Jesus no longer has his place with them. In his place, the disciples will receive dynamis from on high to empower and guide them as they in his name proclaim repentance and forgiveness of sin to all nations. At the end of the day, the disciples returned to Jerusalem from Bethany, where this takes place. And the gospel story ends where it began, in the temple. But where did Jesus go? Since this first departure story at the end of the gospel is taken to be a short version of the ascension in Acts, also by the larger number of manuscripts, which has added something taken to add all the relevant information, and say he ascended. However, there are none of the apocalyptic stage props which we find in the version of Acts, and also the words "he was carried up into heaven," kai aneferato estonoranan, is missing in some major manuscripts. Codex Sinaiticus doesn't have it prior to its scribal corrections. D doesn't have it. The Syriac, one tradition of the Syriac manuscripts do not have it, and also the Itala doesn't have it, or in plural. The sense of departure is unmistakable, as is also the element of divinization as the disciples worship him. It brings the narrative of Jesus' earthly life to an end, as it somehow transfers him to heavenly existence, but it's not yet a story in itself. The ascension. In an article on the hermeneutical challenge which Luke's ascension narrative posts, James Dunn, whom I normally wouldn't quote, I'm afraid, notes that the ascension has provoked surprisingly little interest, be it in treatment of the life of Jesus or in Christology, or even in treatments of Christian doctrine. We don't like it, we are sort of uncomfortable with it. Dunn's explanation is that the spatial movement depicted in the episode is at best puzzling and more likely embarrassing for an age which no longer conceive of heaven up there. Even if I do not follow him when he takes this to call for a reconstructed factual event behind the narrative, his diagnosis may well be right, even if it depends on a merger of the two Lucan versions. Meaning and truth claims are to the so-called modern mind, and I suppose that's our mind as well, often intimately attached to a kind of scientific or empirical factuality which pre-modern presentations cannot possibly meet. Since the pre-modern cosmology no longer is regarded as sustainable, Christian theology has tended to submit and take refuge to the future as the last unknown. It's easier to keep eschatology and to keep this kind of cosmological story. The temporal eschatological perspective has therefore become all predominant, and mythological stories about spatial mobility between heaven and earth are left behind as embarrassing for an age which no longer conceives of heaven up there. But it is, however, important not to oversimplify or misinterpret the spatial approach in ancient texts in crude literal terms. A spatial approach may also apply to a mental symbolic map. And this is recently very common in also research in religions of antiquity. Lately, the restoration of mythology and a renewed interest in early Jewish and Christian mysticism and angelology have, to some degree, changed the situations described now, as has a continued form critical work on the various types of ascension stories. However, rather than applying a form critical approach, I want to look at Jesus' post-resurrectional experiences and ascension in order to see how bodies are taken to change according to location and space. In the Transfiguration story, which Luke shares with Mark and Matthew, Jesus takes 3, which is told earlier in the Gospel as a prefiguration. Jesus takes 3 of his disciples with him up on the mountain, and while he prays, the appearance of his face is changed and his clothes become dazzling white. Before their eyes, he is said to be transformed into heavenly brightness. Traditional markers of Epiphany are in abundance: the mountain setting, the heavenly visitors, clouds and voices from above, as well as categories of light and brightness. As Jesus is transfigured, Moses and Elijah appear, also they in glory. Adela Collins, in her great commentary on Mark, thinks that the Transfiguration probably was not originally a resurrection appearance stories, but rather evokes an ancient genre of epiphany and metamorphosis. The Transfiguration may then be understood in 2 different ways. Either the true nature of Jesus as divine is being momentarily revealed, or it is a temporary change in anticipation of the final one. However, peculiar to Luke is an unusual choice of terms when Moses, Elijah, and Jesus speak about his departure, his exodus, which he is about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Moses and Elijah are not great figures from the past representing the law and the prophets. Rather, they are present because the promises they were given are about to be fulfilled. They were also among the immortals, those who did not see death, but according to Jewish tradition were taken up to heaven. Elijah was, of course, famous for translation by carriage to heaven. But also Moses was assumed not to have died. Their presence at the transfiguration of Jesus indicates that, like them, Jesus will not see death, but somehow be translated into heaven and transformed into the glory and brightness which the story prefigures. The Transfiguration story serves as a preview, a trailer, we might say today, of the heavenly, immortal, and illuminated Jesus. Significantly, the Transfiguration is located between Jesus' first prediction of his redemption, suffering, and resurrection, and the second. Immediately afterwards, the Lucan travel narrative, the story of his exodus begins, when the days drew near for him to be taken up, and that is the language of the text. He set his face to go to Jerusalem. Ultimately, the way leads not just to Jerusalem, but to heaven. So an ascension story might be in place after all. The emphasis in the Lucan post-resurrectional appearances on the psychic presence of the resurrected Jesus is obvious, apart from the liminal features of untraceable mobility. Neither does Jesus' departure from his disciples at the end of the gospel narrative display any transformative or angelomorphic traits. He doesn't transform or transfigure before their eyes. He simply disappears from sight, or the sight of his disciples, and there is apparently no immediate interest in how it happens and whether he is undergoing change. The perspective remains throughout in the gospel story with the disciples. What they observe and eventually do as they return to Jerusalem to wait for Jesus' promise to become effective and the mission to begin. There are, however, elsewhere in Luke again, indications about Jesus' heavenly existence, particularly in the Son of Man discourse. In Luke 22:69, it's predicted that Jesus as the Son of Man will take his seat at the right hand of the power of God. It may be that Jesus moves towards becoming the Son of Man, and that his temporal process concurs with a spatial relocation from earthly to heavenly existence, most clearly expressed in Luke 12, "And I tell you, everyone who acknowledges me before others, the Son of Man will also acknowledge before the angels of God, but whoever denies me before others will be denied before the angels of God." Furthermore, it is inherent to the Lucan concept of remembrance that Jesus continues to be present in the collective commemoration of what he told them when he was still with them. The gospel story concludes by his departure and the promise of continued support, if not of presence. Thus the account in Acts of Paul's encounter with the ascended Jesus of Nazareth carry the marks of Epiphany and divine doxa. There is a blinding light and a voice, but there is no body, no sighting, other than by light. Transposition from an earthly existence to a heavenly requires bodily transformation, and in order to describe the heavenly body, categories of light and brightness, of doxa, are employed. These are noticeable substances, yet without tangible solidity or quality. They mark difference rather than continuity and recognizability. According to John Collins, early apocalyptic literature does not provide much description of the transformed heavenly state beyond referring to the elevated righteous as luminous and shining, sometimes in terms of donning glory as a garment, and thereby attaining equality with the angels. And Luke comes in some ways very close to that. In 1 Corinthians 15, and this is the last part, Paul depends on and defends a taxonomy, where the division of cosmos into two different spaces of habitation, the terrestrial and the celestial, is fundamental. The genus of Soma is accordingly divided into two diverse species, heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. And under each of the two species, further subdivisions sharing the same basic quality might be distinguished, but without any indication of a hierarchical order. The emphasis is not on the internal classification in each group, but on the quality and qualitative difference between earthly and heavenly. The quality of all earthly bodies is carnal, even if they do not share the same kind of flesh, whereas the quality of all heavenly bodies are characterized by their radiance, their doxa. A certain kind of body belongs to a particular space. It has its own habitat. Sarx belongs on earth, doxa in heaven. These qualities serve as boundary markers. Therefore, states Paul himself emphatically in this chapter on resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, in verse 50, "Flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of God, and the perishable cannot inherit the imperishable." Cosmology and eschatology are made to intersperse in that spatial categories are matched by temporal, or rather sequential categories. Hence, continuity as expressed by recognizability plays little role, not to say no role, since resurrection is not perceived as bodily restoration. Rather, it involves transformations, which requires that also those still alive when it happens are subject to radical change. Paul further maintains that the relationship between the present body and the one recreated in the resurrection is analogous to that between seed and plant growing from it. As the seed perishes, it dies. There is a dependency and sequence, but no apparent likeness. Geoffrey Asher has shown that the varieties of terrestrial and celestial bodies, as listed by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, correspond to descriptions found in ancient Greek and philosophical sources. But these lists serve other purposes, and they lack the contrast established between two kinds, the locative polarity and which argumentatively precedes the temporal. The background and origin of this particular taxonomy is therefore nebulous. Paul regards this taxonomy as the divinely created design of creation. Fundamental to it is the division of cosmos into two diverse, not to say opposite, spaces of habitation, the terrestrial and the celestial. The genus of Soma was accordingly divided into two diverse species, heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. And under each of these two species, further subdivisions sharing the same basic quality might be distinguished. The emphasis is not on the internal classification in each group, but on the qualitative difference between earthly and heavenly. The quality of all earthly bodies is carnal, even if they do not share the same kind of flesh, whereas the heavenly bodies are characterized by their gradients, their doxa. A certain kind of body belongs to a particular space. Sarx is characteristic of and belongs on the earth. Doxa is characteristic of and belongs in heaven. They serve, as I've already said, as spatial boundary markers. From this follows that flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of God, and the perishable cannot inherit the imperishable. Flesh is perishable, and therefore subject to ultimate change, that of corruption through aging and death. Earthly bodies, as constituted by sarx, do not possess immortality. They are deemed to perish like a seed in the soil. Hence, transposition from an earthly existence to heavenly is not conceivable without transformation from flesh to glory. In order to move across that divide, radical change of transformation is necessary. This is only possible due to the creative will and power of God, who gives to each a body as he chooses, in an instant, in the twinkling of an eye, as Paul says. And that, of course, is the only way you can accommodate that in Greek philosophy. The one feature which in this taxonomy resists adaptation to a divide that can be overcome only by complete transformation is the notion that also terrestrial bodies possess doxa. Of course, Paul explicitly states that the doxa of heavenly bodies is different from the earthly, but it still means that earthly bodies are not without doxa, and that this quality somehow is the reflection of the Creator in creation. Human beings, as created by God, are potentially what one might call blended beings. Is similar taxonomic presuppositions traceable in Luke Acts? Are spatial boundaries being negotiated in similar ways? I think they are. The emphasis in the Lucan post-resurrectional stories on the physical presence of the resurrected Jesus, including his partaking of food, is obvious. And it reflects the fact that he is still on earth, although in liminal transit. As the gospel ends, Jesus is no longer with the disciples. His corporeal presence among them has ceased, and the glimpses one gets in Acts of his heavenly existence affirms some kind of transfiguration to light. And that's the end of this lecture. And there's a lot to discuss, and I know that. Tomorrow I will deal with what happens then as the disciples continue on earth? And how do the second ending work in relation to the fact that Jesus is no longer there?
Would you be willing to entertain a couple of questions?
Indeed.
Okay, so if you'd like to pose a question, some of us know her, but please just identify yourself so she'll know who you are. John?
Yeah. You have heard this before, John. At least part of it.
Why does Luke want to limit the period of post-resurrection appearances?
That's a very good question. And I think it does because he no longer did appear. I mean, the fact is the appearances ceased.
Is there any relationship between the coming of
It
the
ceased.
Spirit?
I mean, pardon. But it may also be that the way he, I mean, this is for tomorrow with Acts. You have the appearances from heaven, or you can, heaven can open up, but he wouldn't come down. What you see would be the light of him. Like Paul, he doesn't see him. He doesn't appear to Paul. There's a voice.
Well, doesn't Paul claim to have seen him?
I'm not talking about Luke. Paul claims he's seen. Paul claims he appeared to him in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah.
Together with a lot of other people, not mentioned elsewhere, but in Paul.
Would Luke have allowed?
Oh, sorry, no, I make the same mistake. Trying to get closer, and then I forget about the microphone, sorry. No, but it's a good question. But there is a period where it seems to cease for all of them, all the New Testament texts.
Would Luke have allowed Paul's claim that Christ appeared to him, or would he have said that's a different ballgame?
He doesn't. I mean, he has a different story about it. And it's important for him that story is different, to keep the cosmology in place somehow. Or the cosmological dimension of this, I would rather say, in place. And it's the one text I do have problems with is the vision of the Son of Man at the first, at Stephen. He sees, but he doesn't see Jesus. He sees the Son of Man, and this has. Yeah, and this has to do, I think, also with the development of the Son of Man idea in early Christianity. But this is complicated, and I'm trying, with the way I formulate this, to not be provocative. I think I'm sincere, but to raise questions that some people find very difficult to address, and that is because they go against what you have been taught. At least in Christian doctrine. Adela.
So, you're right. You're upsetting categories that I at least thought I had established in my own mind, at least. That one way of looking at the appearance to the wide group of disciples is that Luke is being apologetic. There have been people who've been denying the resurrection, and he rejects that Jesus is a pneuma, which, if not in the 1 Peter and later texts, I've read them that way, but that's how they talk about resurrection. It's the pneuma that arrives.
Oh, yes.
And also in some Second Temple Jewish texts, their bones will rest in the earth and their spirits will rejoice on heaven. that Luke is rejecting that idea of Jesus' resurrection to the point of having him eat.
Mm-hmm.
But with your reading of it, it seems as though there are two stages.
Yeah, no, there are two spaces. And when he's moved from one space or one realm to a different, that changes. So it's his earthly existence that requires this physicality, even to the extent of eating. He is in a way, a bodily, almost human being in those texts. His corporeality is fully there.
And yet it's not the resuscitation of a corpse.
No.
Because people can be prevented from recognizing him by divine power, presumably. And because he passes
No, exactly.
through the doors.
And of course, a lot of I've taken that to be. I interpret that in liminal categories, and not in as bodily aspects, or so. Because for me, this pattern is clearly defined as in Paul by sphere, by heavenly and earthly spheres.
This raises in my mind probably too large a question.
See, I'm sure.
Does this have anything to do with Luke's understanding of the parousia? That is, does there come a time that Jesus does come back for all to see? Or is Rudolf Bultmann right in suggesting that eschatological urgency is lost altogether?
Yeah,
actually
it is.
Only history to take into place.
I wouldn't disagree. I wouldn't disagree with Bultmann.
You think Bultmann's right about that?
I think he has at least caught something that is there, and that's, you have the whole volume of Acts witnessing to that.
But you could say that even in Mark 13, the Son of Man does not come down to earth.
No.
You know, you could say the heavens are open.
Is that-
He's revealed in his heavenly state,
Yeah.
and he sends angels to gather
Yeah.
the elect.
The Son of Man is a heavenly figure.
Yeah.
Does this work in Matthew?
No.
I didn't think so.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Matthew, I thought of having. I thought of having Matthew, and of course that's a very short story.
Yes.
And that is also very often read as an ascension story, because you have the mountain, and it's the last words on the mountain, even though it's not told you, and it's the end. So, but that is not an ascension. That's a kind of transition to ubiquity. That he will be with them everywhere, at any time, everywhere and whenever. And of course that is, some would read that as a sacramental text or as a text of homilies and preaching, which it probably also is. That is disciples as they fulfill the mission on which they are sent. He will be there in what they do. So the whole idea of ubiquity is so strongly there in Matthew. It is actually the biblical text that has that as a major concluding idea. So it shows the possible variation, and how you struggle with the same problem of making it continue somehow,
Well,
having it continue somehow.
If you followed, you've certainly been challenged to think about these in a different way. And we thank Professor Karlsen Seim for her very stimulating and challenging presentation. And look forward to the presentation tomorrow. Thank you very much.